Welcome, good morning or good afternoon, depending on the time zone. I welcome you to the symposium titled The Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging, 20 years later. My name is Marvin FORMOSA. I am the director of the International Institute on Aging, United Nations, Malta, and the resident academic at the Department of Gerontology and Dementia Studies at the University of Malta. I will be the first speaker in this symposium, and my talk will be titled The Madrid Plan of Action on Aging, Global Successes and Limitations. So, as I have introduced myself, I said I will be the first speaker, and my aim in this limited amount of minutes is to give a bit of an overview on the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging, which everybody terms as MIPA for short. So the MIPA, when it was launched in 2002, thanks to the hard work of Alexandre, who is with us today, of course, channeled the whole of aging policies in a new stream, basically, towards a society for all ages. And of course, it first looked at aging as some positive aspect in people's lives. So aging is really a time of opportunities. Whilst the Vienna plan perhaps focused much more on the negative aspects of later life, MIPA was more positive. However, we can never forget that aging is a social problem. And of course, much of our work as gerontologists focus on the negative aspects of aging, or the challenging aspects of aging, rather than negative, like ageism and abuse. The name of the symposium is 20 years later. And 20 years later, I feel that one has to perhaps expand or perhaps discuss a little bit further the MIPA, and especially focus on human rights. Because I believe that there has been a lot of work in the past decade, especially by the United Nations Economic Open-Ended Working Group on Aging, which has highlighted how perhaps policy for older persons can only move forward if it respects and safeguards human rights. And in fact, I always like to say that human rights do not become obsolete with age. But unfortunately, that's the situation. Many human rights enjoyed by younger persons are not enjoyed by older persons. So basically, a question which we have to ask ourselves, we may not necessarily arrive at an answer today, is whether MIPA protects the human rights of older persons. In answering this question, whether MIPA safeguards human rights, one has to look at a statement delivered by the Secretary General in 2011. And one can note a certain level of dissatisfaction with MIPA here, because of course, MIPA is ultimately a soft law, a soft policy framework, whereby governments are encouraged to implement their recommendations, but perhaps enforcement is not so much clear. It is uncertain how we can enforce government in implementing the recommendations, and therefore any discussion of MIPA must introduce what the UN Secretary General actually did, introduce the term human rights. And in fact, the past decade has been very much characterized by the open-ended working group organized by the United Nations, which specifically focused on whether there is a need for a human rights convention for older persons. And if we start with perhaps the case against the Human Rights Convention, and perhaps a more favorable approach towards MIPA, one can argue the following arguments: that universalism enjoys the rights of all people, of all groups of people, irrespective. So basically the human rights document is there. Soft law protections, soft recommendations are actually strong enough, and that perhaps a further convention would be too costly. Yes, and I believe that nations are a bit hesitant to 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 speak too much favor on a convention, because of course a convention would mean that the recommendation must be enforced within a specific time frame. And of course, then there will be paradoxes between different conventions. So we may have a convention, we already have a convention for persons with disability. And what if we have a convention for older persons? And what we may perhaps even have further conventions, like, for example, conventions for the rights of persons living with dementia. So if you have different conventions, there might be contradictions, paradoxes. And of course, then there is another argument that drawing attention to other people in this way would even increase their exclusion, their social marginalization. On the other hand, there is a clear case in favor for a human rights convention for older persons, in that older persons are still experiencing a violation of their rights based on their age, irrespective of MIPA, despite MIPA, and despite the 5-year reviews of MIPA in every country. That the diversity of definition would obviously improve, it would obviously make more clear the articulation of age-specific rights. So the situation of an older person is very different from the situation of a younger person. And because older persons and younger persons are different, this is a contested, of course, field, but I do believe that there are differences, and in different stages of the life course would, of course, ensure that certain rights are more safeguarded. The dignity of older people will certainly be improved if there's a human rights convention. And of course, many believe that a human rights convention would also be a better instrument to mitigate against prejudice, against stereotypes, against ageism, perhaps. Because ultimately, COVID-19 taught us that much of the improvements that we have experienced are very not soft. I mean, they are they're very robust, because when COVID-19, then something that emerged very clearly was how societies endorse ageism, because older people were treated differently from younger people during the COVID pandemic. There are many publications on this, and I'm sure that you have all encountered such evidence. And finally, yes, ageism, this practically I have already mentioned, this ageism is, of course, we will be in a better position to struggle against ageism, to defeat ageism, although ageism can never be thoroughly defeated, if there is a human rights convention. So going on to my final slide, time is pressing. So where do we go from here? I believe that there are four important pathways. The first is to allow human rights advocates to lobby and monitor in their countries, and they ensure that the international law is put into domestic law, and therefore the MIPA needs to be more present in national laws. There must be a new generation of political will for positive change. Many countries, unfortunately, have not even started to deal with the problem of population aging. Many countries are still without national policies on aging, are still without national policies on dementia care, are without any guidelines as regards to end-of-life care, etc. So we have done a lot, but the road is still, we're still very much in the initial steps of this long road. The fourth, law. It's very important that the law is very sensitive to older persons' rights. Many criminal cases, many criminal laws still do not include the terms or define the terms, for example, elder abuse. So we need to ensure that the law actually supports the MIPA, supports what is a MIPA. It's no good having MIPA and then having a law that does not enforce it. And finally, education. It's very important that we educate. By we, I mean the policymakers, stakeholders, educate the public, and of course, influence a shift against the biases and negative attitudes towards older persons. And so this is a very important document, in my opinion, and I encourage you to read it. There are, of course, others, but this is one from which I have taken most of the ideas, so I'm ethically obliged to reference it. And I look forward so that MIPA is strengthened and even perhaps mainstreamed into national policies, both for the life course and also for specifically dealing with older persons. Thank you much. Thank you very much for listening. The second speaker on this symposium is none other than Dr. Alexandre SIDORENKO. Dr. Alexandre SIDORENKO needs no introduction, but of course, I must certainly introduce him and say that he was the champion and the chief architect of the Madrid Plan, Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging in the early 2000s, when it was presented in Madrid and signed by nation states. So, Alexandre SIDORENKO, it's your floor.
Greetings from Vienna. My name is Alexandre SIDORENKO. I am advisor to the European Center for Social Welfare Policy and Research here in Vienna, Austria. My presentation is about policy responses to aging in Eastern Europe. I will focus on the implementation of the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging in these countries. The definition and classification of Eastern European countries are vague, inconsistent, and variable. Geographically, the Eastern European countries belong to the region of Europe, of course, and are located to the east and southeast of the countries of the European Union. Geopolitically, the three countries of Western Asia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia are also included in the Eastern European group. The countries of Eastern Europe and Western Asia can be divided into two subgroups. The first subgroup is post-Soviet countries of Eastern Europe and Western Asia, which include Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Georgia, Moldova, Russia, and Ukraine. And the second subgroup, Western Balkan countries, including Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Serbia. This division into two subgroups is based on both geographic and political criteria. All 12 countries of both subgroups differ from each other geopolitically. Meanwhile, they also have some common political past, since during the several decades of the 20th century, they all belong to the so-called Soviet bloc or communist bloc of European and Asian countries. That not so distant past has left a significant imprint on the social policy of all these countries, including their policies on aging. The countries of Eastern Europe are often referred to as countries, quote, in transition, unquote. The process of transition of the Eastern European countries involves a profound transformation of their economic, political, and social structures and functions. The demographic transition is one of the dimensions of the transitional nature of the Eastern European countries. All the countries of Eastern Europe have advanced along the path of demographic transition, owing to two universal and interrelated processes of declining mortality and declining fertility. However, there are obvious differences between the two groups of Eastern European countries in the dynamics of these processes. The decline in the fertility in the post-Soviet countries after the collapse of the USSR in 1991 was steeper than the decline in fertility in the countries of Western Balkans. Besides, almost all post-Soviet countries have experienced significant increase in mortality during the last 2 decades of the 21st century, and particularly during the first post-Soviet decade. In the following decades, the high mortality had gradually declined. The increased mortality rate during the penultimate decade of the last century was also noticeable in the countries of the Western Balkans. But its magnitude and duration were less pronounced than in the countries of the former USSR. Life expectancy in all Eastern European countries has already rebounded over the past decade, yet the gap in life expectancy between East and West, between Western European countries and post-Soviet countries and Western European countries and Balkan states is still visible. The adverse health effects of the ongoing COVID pandemic have yet to be assessed, but some evidence points to a particularly serious impact of the pandemic on Eastern Europe. Migration is the third demographic factor that can influence the age structure of the population. Its role in shaping the demographic landscape in several Eastern European countries is evident. After the collapse of the USSR, all post-Soviet countries experienced to some effect the negative net migration rates. Out-migration was particularly felt in Georgia, followed in descending order by Armenia and Moldova. During the same period, the countries of the Western Balkans also lost their population due to immigration, but the highest rates was in Bosnia and Herzegovina, followed by Albania. Young people predominate among migrants. Therefore, the process of migration, depending on its scale, can affect the age composition of the population in both sending and receiving countries. Despite the obvious differences in the tempo and magnitude of the demographic transition of the Eastern European countries, there is also the relative demographic homogeneity of the age structure of this group of countries, with the exception of the demographically younger Azerbaijan. The demographic parameters of which closely resembles those in the countries of Southeastern Asia, the closest region of developing countries. Population and individual aging present both challenges and opportunities that are universal in nature, but contain distinct national as well as regional and even local community level identities. The principal question is whether the governments of the countries of Eastern Europe recognize the issues of aging as national priority for policy action and follow the recommendations of the international policy frameworks on aging. Of all 12 Eastern European countries, governments of only 2 countries, Azerbaijan and Belarus, view the aging of their population as the minor concern. The majority, 10 countries of the 12, thought that aging of population, individual aging, is the major concern of their policies. To respond to the challenges of aging and opportunities of longevity, the international community developed various policy frameworks. The international policy frameworks for addressing the challenges and opportunities of population and individual aging have been available for nearly 40 years. Key international policy frameworks include the Vienna International Plan of Action on Aging of 1982, the United Nations Principles for Older Persons, and the most recent, the Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging. The Eastern European countries belong to the region of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe, actually the largest region among all regions of the United Nations. The implementation of the Madrid Plan of Action on Aging in this region is guided by the United Nations Economic Commission Regional Implementation Strategy for the Madrid Plan of Action on Aging, which was developed the same year, 2002, as the Madrid Plan of Action on Aging. 7 of the 12 Eastern European countries participated in all 3 review and appraisals of the implementation of the Madrid Plan of Action on Aging and submitted their national reports on the implementation, with the exception of, as this table shows, Georgia and Montenegro. National policy documents on aging exist in 9 out of 12 Eastern European countries. Ukraine and Belarus have recently adopted their national strategies on active longevity or active aging. The COVID-19 pandemic has affected the lives of people of all ages. At the same time, older persons have become the most obvious victims of the pandemic and its containment measures. All the elements of the new COVID reality can be found in the countries of Eastern Europe. The new reality instigated by the pandemic has also affected the elaboration and implementation of international and national policies on aging, and especially policies for active aging. The COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated the inadequacy of our current international and national policy approaches to individual and population aging. Moreover, the pandemic has exacerbated the tension between policy approaches to individual aging and population aging. A conflict between the immediate task of saving individual lives and public demand to revive the economy has emerged. Quote, the political debate about how to tackle the pandemic has often placed health and the economy in opposition, unquote, Richard Horton, 2021. On February 24, 2022, the Coronavirus Resource Center at Johns Hopkins University stopped uploading data from Ukraine as the information ceased to arrive from the country bombarded by Russian army. The new reality has taken a new turn, much more disgusting and dangerous, primarily for the people of Ukraine, but also for the whole of Europe and for the whole world. For people of all ages, once again, all the people are among the most vulnerable and affected. How to respond to the challenges of this latest reality is still unclear, but we must find a solution. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. SIDORENKO. It's been a pleasure listening to your wonderful presentation, and we learned a lot. And now it's time for our third speaker on the symposium, Professor Mala Kapur SHANKARDASS from India. Again, Professor SHANKARDASS is well known in the field. She has worked tirelessly in all around the world, but especially in the Indian subcontinent. And she will be now addressing the symposium on the MIPA as it refers to the South Asian perspective.
I'm happy to be part of this session and bring focus on the South Asia response to Madrid International Plan of Action on Aging, which is MIPA. Talking about MIPA and South Asia specifically, we find that in all the 8 countries of South Asia, namely Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, adopted the Madrid Plan of Action on Aging in April 2002. This was a milestone step for South Asia in giving prominence to aging issues at their respective national levels. But some countries showed a better response based on their respective situation. Thus, I refer more to those countries which have shown considerable progress. All 8 countries from this century have been witnessing demographic transition with age structures changing rapidly. However, in some, it is at a faster pace than others, and that is also the reason for certain countries taking aging more seriously. Talking about the demographic reality of South Asia, we find that it definitely calls for action on aging. The region is heterogeneous, with countries reflecting not only difference in demographic and epidemiological transition, but also in the development process. However, the population age pyramids of all of them reflect narrower bases and broader higher levels, which clearly signals that the respective governments must address aging for the benefit of the full population. In other words, we find that the children are reducing, the adult population is expanding, and older population is increasing rapidly. The feminization of aging in South Asia brings in gender considerations and specific planning, which has been emphasized by MIPA, but has not been given appropriate thought in planning programs and provisions for older women in the respective countries, where the percentage of widows is also high, and they are the most vulnerable section of the aging population, thus requiring specific attention and planning. The fast growing proportions of 80+ population also over the next 3 decades, as per available latest UN statistics, requires immediate societal policy responses, especially as extreme old age brings in more of social and healthcare problems, and these countries are not so well prepared for it. The achievements as part of directions from MIPA are reflected now, as in some of the countries. To understand the consequences and implications of population aging, UNFPA initiated research studies for Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. Also, some initiatives were prompted by World Health Organization, International Labour Organization, and United Nations SCAP. Further, these countries have been gradually and regularly assessing the implementation process and reporting to UN SCAP regional meetings. Taking forward MIPA directions, for instance, Indian government participated in cross-country WHO study on global aging and adult health, which is the SAGE study, to examine patterns and dynamics of age-related changes in health and well-being. India also initiated its first longitudinal study on aging, which is the LASI study, to capture physical, health, and economic conditions of older people through key indicators of active aging index. And this study is a very remarkable study because it's covering huge population of the country and covering almost all the states. Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka have set up policies and programs which give priority to older people in social pensions, food security, healthcare, and income support. But implementation constraints in allocating resources for universal reach are more visible, and this needs to be corrected. Nonetheless, certain practices need to be applauded, such as provisions for microcredit facilities, which includes older people in Bangladesh, and also few of countries like India is wanting to follow suit also in this direction. So in some ways, there has been a proactive response, and this is seen that many of these countries developed institutional arrangements and national legal instruments to address emerging aging issues. For example, mistreatment of older people, providing appropriate health and social care services, representation of older people in certain decision-making processes by encouraging formation of NGOs working on aging issues and partnering with government in taking forward aged care provisions, making certain community-based facilities available. These countries also emphasized in humanitarian and disaster relief programs inclusion of older people, especially as many of them are prone to floods, droughts, and other disasters. However, we do find that still much more needs to be done in this direction, but the emphasis has begun, and that is a good sign. We also see a lot of emphasis on life course perspective, which has come into various programs and policies. In the 4 countries mentioned earlier, especially Bangladesh, India, Nepal, and Sri Lanka, even though it is in small measures, but they have attempted as part of implementation of MIPA to improve the health and social security coverage, bring in poverty reduction programs through the life cycle approach. Attention has also been given to promote the rights of older people and protect them against age discriminatory practices. Thus, opportunities for reemployment are being generated, and midlife skill development facilities are coming up in these countries. Many provisions now exist as part of supporting enabling environments for people as they age. Better transport is one example, and emphasis on ramps is another example, along with improved lighting on roads, as well as we find many assistive technologies are being put in place. In terms of response to COVID pandemic, certain practices reflect MIPA directions, but there have been few limitations too. To begin with, there was a low level of pandemic preparedness in South Asia, especially as the health systems in the countries indicated certain vulnerable responses. But the region did well in mounting an appropriate disaster management response to the pandemic by giving priority to older people, especially with vaccinations. However, the countries realized it is imperative for them to build on strong health systems, catering to physical and mental issues, and be prepared for pandemics. And that is a good lesson learned. In addition, the need to develop information communication technologies and include older people for digitalized provisions has been a positive outcome. Many were included in use of WhatsApp. Many were taught how to use computers, get connected through Zoom, etc. Though reaching to older people, rural populations, and those residing in remote areas is a challenge, as much it is to include all in digital literacy programs. In terms of challenges while assessing impact of MIPA, we find that South Asia does not have robust data collection tools for planning, monitoring, and evaluation of aging policies. Where census and household surveys are conducted on a regular basis, the limiting factor is that these do not cover specific information on older people in terms of different parameters. In some countries, Bangladesh, India, Maldives, Nepal, Pakistan, and Sri Lanka, certain policy initiatives were taken to address population aging as per the 3 directions of MIPA, but more evidence is needed to assess if effective practices are in place and whether they could mainstream aging. Building a society for all ages, a concept of MIPA, also met with certain constraints, as having equity between generations had social and economic limitations across these nations. Referring to challenges that need to be overcome, I would state that most of these countries have encouraged NGOs to provide community-based healthcare through mobile health units, but a compilation of national-level voluntary activities to improve care services has yet to take place. Also, provisions for domestic and nursing care within the home environment have to be made more accessible and affordable. Training programs for informal and community-based caregivers have to be made available, as well as standardized, with emphasis on quality, as well as keeping in mind gender considerations. Developing long-term care is an urgent need, along with end-of-life care. Besides, images of older people need a more proactive response. They need to be seen more as a resource and not as a dependent population. Expansion of geriatric healthcare needs greater focus. We find the geriatric and mental health services to its aging population is being developed in most countries. For instance, Sri Lanka created the National Policy on Elderly Health. India has a healthcare program for the elderly. Bangladesh stressed on expansion of health services and treatment facilities for older persons, including for mental health and addressing disability issues. Yet, large gaps exist with regard to provision of qualified care for older persons and availability of healthcare at affordable rates across rural and urban areas. Geriatric services at primary healthcare level, as well as tertiary level, need advancement. Universalization of holistic geriatric care and making it accessible throughout the country needs greater planning and consideration on active aging principles, along with addressing elder abuse concerns. So in conclusion, I would say, as countries continue to evaluate the progress made over the last 20 years after adoption of MIPA, some governments and various stakeholders are realizing that there is need to strengthen social and healthcare systems, along with financial security and protection systems, and make them inclusive for the vulnerable segments within the aging populations, such as women, especially older widows, those with disabilities, those living alone, those in rural, tribal, remote, and also in conflict areas. With that, I come to the end. Thank you for your patient listening.
Thank you, Professor SHANKARDASS. Again, a wonderful presentation. Certainly good to hear so many things and enlightening moments. And I'm sure that the audience has a lot to reflect. The fourth and final speaker of the symposium is Dr. Marcela Bustamante. Apologies for the perhaps mispronunciation. And Dr. Bustamante is a very prominent voice as regards aging in the South American region. And in fact, her presentation will focus on this particular South American continent. Marcela, it's up to you.
Muy buenas tardes a toda la audiencia. Es un gusto para mí estar en este espacio y muchas gracias también al doctor Marvin Formosa por extenderme esta invitación. y a mis colegas del panel también los saludo cariñosamente. Se me ha pedido hablar del Plan Madrid y todo el proceso que ha surtido en América Latina y el Caribe. Como sabemos, el Plan Madrid es una declaración política de todos los estados para adoptar una agenda programática y abordar y encarar el envejecimiento a nivel global. ¿Qué ha significado el Plan Madrid para América Latina? Pues hay que dividir entre el 2017 un antes y un después, porque un antes, en el 2017, digamos, el Plan Madrid junto al Consenso de Montevideo eran de los pocos instrumentos que la región contaba para hacer frente al envejecimiento. Pero como sabemos, tanto el Consenso de Montevideo como el Plan Madrid son instrumentos del derecho blando, o sea que son referentes, pero no son vinculantes. En el 2017, la región cuenta con un instrumento del derecho duro, que es la Convención Interamericana para la Protección de los Derechos Humanos y por tanto es vinculante para los estados que se adhieran. Entonces, ¿cómo se complementan esos dos instrumentos o cómo se han complementado? Pues de alguna otra manera, la convención es el cuerpo programático, es el cuerpo axiomático de principios, derechos, deberes, y el plan pues es más orientado hacia la práctica. Entonces, el plan le facilita a los gobiernos a ir tomando pasos y acciones para acercarse a un terreno fértil y poder animarse a adherirse a la convención. Así es que yo veo, digamos, cómo se complementan esos dos instrumentos o cómo se han complementado. En América Latina, pues el envejecimiento ha sido acelerado. Vemos que en el 2050 el porcentaje de la población mayor va a estar representada en un alto porcentaje de 25,4%, partiendo en el 2017 en un 11,8%. O sea, vemos que en el 2050 se va a más que duplicar la población de personas mayores. Lo que no es malo ni bueno, o sea, digamos que sin ningún juicio de valor, lo que sí exige es una agenda política que dé prioridad al aceleramiento del envejecimiento en la población, ¿no? Europa ha tenido un mayor tiempo para adecuar sus políticas públicas, pero América Latina pues está en mora de hacerlo. Esta es una línea de tiempo, digamos, de lo que ha pasado en la región. Bueno, en el 82 se dio pues la primera conferencia global de envejecimiento, donde pues surgió el Plan de Viena, y pues en el 2002 viene la segunda conferencia o la Asamblea Global de Envejecimiento con el Plan Madrid. Entonces, mi presentación va a tener esta estructura resaltando lo que ha sido más importante de cada revisión que se ha surtido, que tiene lugar cada 5 años en la región. Bueno, la primera conferencia regional intergubernamental de envejecimiento se dio un año después de adoptarse el Plan Madrid, en el 2003. Y es un instrumento de suma relevancia porque de alguna manera contextualiza el Plan Madrid a las realidades de esta región y facilita unos objetivos y unas metas que han sido posibles, digamos, el seguimiento y el reporte. En cuanto a su implementación de este instrumento, quiero resaltar una definición de desarrollo, ¿no? Que el desarrollo no es solamente la producción de bienes y servicios, sino es el acceso equitativo de la población para su autorrealización. Me parece que es un paradigma esa definición y que hacia allá debemos entender el desarrollo. Ese instrumento, repito, pues contextualiza la estrategia regional de implementación, pues nos permitió contextualizar el plan a nuestras realidades. La segunda conferencia de envejecimiento, pues arroja la Declaración de Brasilia en el 2007, 5 años después de haberse, digamos, adoptado la estrategia regional, y hace 2 pronunciamientos muy importantes que van a tener un eco internacional. 2 de ellos, bueno, el primero es que resaltan la necesidad de tener una Convención Internacional de los Derechos Humanos. Y el segundo, también importante, es que apelan a la necesidad de tener un relator especial en el Consejo de Derechos Humanos para las personas mayores. Digamos que vamos a ver en el desarrollo que estas 2 reclamos que salieron de la Declaración de Brasilia, pues tuvieron una acogida internacional. La tercera conferencia regional de envejecimiento, bueno, dio como resultado la Carta de San José en el 2012, y pues también tiene algunos pronunciamientos importantes que trascienden lo regional, ¿no? Aquí ya hay un manifiesto apoyo del grupo de composición abierta que se creó en el 2010 y pues que tiene la misión de redactar una convención internacional. También da apoyo, manifiesta el grupo de trabajo creado en el marco de la OEA para la formulación de una convención interamericana para la protección de las personas mayores. También reitera que es necesario tener un relator especial en el tema de derechos de las personas mayores y pues promueve otras iniciativas de suma importancia en el área de seguridad social. En esta tercera conferencia, solicitud de la sociedad civil, y ahí quiero pues también reconocer que la sociedad civil paso a paso ha ganado un espacio de participación, no es suficiente, pero acá se ve que sugirieron el nombre, un cambio en el nombre de las conferencias que se habían venido surtiendo y propusieron incluir en el nombre la persona mayor, que era el sujeto en cuestión, ¿no? O sea, yo creo que las reivindicaciones en el lenguaje son también ganancias que van a reflejarse pues, en cambios sociales. La cuarta conferencia de envejecimiento, la cual pues tuve la oportunidad de participar, fue en el 2017 en Asunción y pues terminó con la Declaración de Asunción. De la última conferencia al 2017 pues se dieron cambios muy importantes tanto a nivel regional como global que se van a ver reflejados en esta declaración. El primero de ellos es la adopción en el 2015 de la Agenda 2030 y los Objetivos de Desarrollo Sostenible. Y a nivel regional, pues en el 2017, antes de esa reunión, entró en vigencia la Convención Interamericana para la Protección de los Derechos de las Personas Mayores. Entonces, digamos que estos 2 momentos tan cruciales a nivel global y regional, pues se van a ver reflejados en esta declaración, donde se reitera, digamos, la responsabilidad del Estado de garantizar la dignidad y el cumplimiento de los derechos de las personas mayores, que en muchos instrumentos o políticas se ve desplazada esa responsabilidad únicamente hacia la familia, pero acá es crucial el manifiesto de que es el Estado el responsable. Igualmente, pues, se reconoce la participación, la importancia de la participación de la sociedad civil en este proceso de revisión e implementación del Plan Madrid. Otro de los aspectos es que se reitera el compromiso que tiene la región de apoyar el grupo de composición abierta que recientemente sesionó en su 12ª sesión y que pues tiene el mandato de ir un paso más y poder redactar un cuerpo que sea la Convención Internacional. Digamos que eso en resumen ha sido pues el proceso que se ha surtido en la región. ¿Cuáles son los retos pendientes? Pues han sido muchos a nivel de gobierno, pues la Convención Interamericana debe ser adherida por todos, solamente 8 países lo han hecho y Colombia está a puertas cuando se surta el depósito de ser el 9º y se requeriría un 10º estado para que se active el mecanismo de seguimiento que la misma convención prevé. En temas de seguridad social también hay una gran deuda histórica hacia las personas mayores y que se ha tratado como un derecho universal, fundamental y no en calidad de subsidio. Otra de las demandas que hay que darle prioridad es la implementación de un sistema de cuidado y de salud universal en línea con la convención, ¿no? Y que no solamente el tema de cuidado sea abocado a los centros de larga estancia, sino que también se le dé el desarrollo a todos los tipos de cuidado domiciliario, comunitario, paliativo, la profesionalización y la remuneración del cuidador. Eso también es una gran tarea pendiente por parte de los gobiernos. La participación de la sociedad civil, obviamente, también hay que garantizarla, ¿no? Y de las personas mayores, como bien la convención lo consagra, es un deber del Estado garantizar esa participación. La generación de datos y de evidencia para visibilizar la situación es otro de las, digamos, de los pendientes. Y pues erradicar la pobreza tanto en lo rural como en lo urbano. En los datos recientes, pues la pandemia hizo estragos socioeconómicos y de todo tipo, pero la pobreza extrema aumentó 2 puntos en la región. O sea que los retos son mayores. En cuanto a las personas mayores, pues también tiene una tarea de empoderarse, de conocer sus derechos, de concebirse como un sujeto de derecho y ejercerse como tal. La sociedad civil también tiene la tarea o el mandato de cohesionarse y abonar a un movimiento, ¿no? Y no actuar tan fraccionada o separadamente, sino crear cada vez alianzas y propender por un movimiento donde pues en el centro estén las personas mayores. Y la academia pues también tiene un rol importante en generar datos, en superar el analfabetismo digital, ¿no? Y crear una oferta que supere eso y que también le permita a las personas mayores seguir aprendiendo y consumir una oferta educativa de calidad y gratuita y universal. Ahí el rol de la academia lo vemos también importante. Para terminar, voy a dejar anunciado un caso de estudio que hicimos de analizar la interseccionalidad entre la vejez y la migración, ¿no? Donde los datos pues son bastante críticos y hicimos la lectura del Plan Madrid y la migración, ¿no? Ya el Plan de Acción Madrid estipulaba que la migración puede, si no es gestionada debidamente, puede generar cambios socioeconómicos que marginalicen al migrante. Entonces, solamente no puedo presentar los datos, solamente los anuncio y lo invitamos a leer el reporte donde pues es evidente que la situación de las personas mayores en movilidad dista no solamente de lo que sugiere el Plan de Acción Madrid, sino a la luz de la Convención Interamericana. Bueno, muchísimas gracias por la atención prestada y bueno, espero poder compartir estos datos en otra oportunidad o en la sección de preguntas. Gracias.
Thank you, Dr. Bustamante. With your presentation, another excellent overview of the field on aging on the South American continent. And that rounds up our symposium, a very global perspective. We have gone through all over the continents in just a few minutes. And now the floor is open for any questions or any point that the audience would like to make. Thank you very much, Marcela and Malam and Dr. SIDORENKO, who is unfortunately not able to be with us because we are both at the UNICE meeting in Rome at the moment, and he has some other conflicting meetings. But anyhow, I think it was an excellent symposium. Now we have gone live. I was told that I will not be able to see the participants who are or were listening to us. And I have been sent a number of questions. So the first question from Guzman Ramos, that's not for this symposium. It asks about gastric tubes and dementia. So I have to skip that. And then a very important question, it says, is the Madrid plan still operational, or is it replaced by the UN Decade of Healthy Aging? The answer is equivocally yes. The Madrid plan is still operational. In fact, today in Rome, we have the 4th review of the MIPA, as we call it. And it has not been replaced by the UN Decade of Healthy Aging, but the UN Decade of Healthy Aging supports MIPA, because of course MIPA was written more than 20 years ago, and therefore it may need some tweaking. Another policy framework which also adds to MIPA are the Sustainable Development Goals. So basically, I would say that the UN now has the Sustainable Development Goals at the very top, and then underneath different policy frameworks for different populations, one of which is, of course, aging. Would you like to add to this, Marcela, Malam?
Okay, thank you. Yes, I think in Latin America, as we do have a regional legal mandatory instrument called the Inter-American Convention of All People Rights, I don't see that MIPA is replaced by the convention. I think both instruments are complementary with each other, as the MIPA is offering like a framework and orientation to take to implement some actions, no? And I think, according with my point of view, the MIPA can help the government to be ready to sign and to ratify the Inter-American Convention. So I agree with you that the MIPA is not replaced. It's a good match with an international convention, or in Latin America with the regional convention.
I have to stop you because time is running out, and there are two questions for you, Marcela. One I have sent it to you because it's in Spanish, and the other one, which is in English. So let's go to the English first. Dr. Conciencia from Tacuman would like to know the 8 American countries that you mentioned. This is in English, so I'm reading it for you. Which are the 8 Latin American countries?
Okay, I will say Uruguay was the first country who signed who ratified the Inter-American Convention. Costa Rica was the second, then Chile, Bolivia, Ecuador, Peru, and El Salvador. I missed something. And Argentina, obviously, Argentina as well. And Colombia, we are on the way to do the deposit, and therefore we cannot say that Colombia has ratified. We need to complete the deposit to the OEA. But there are the 8 countries. I hope I don't miss any country.
No, and the other question is the same one. It's in Spanish. Mala, there's a question. What is the key strategy to build solidarity in order to make the Madrid plan more realistic? From Dilek Aslan from Turkey. So basically the question is, do you have any practical strategies as how to build solidarity between generations?
Thank you, Marvin, and whoever has asked the question. Yes, it's a very relevant question, especially in the Asian context, because we have a large population which is young, and it is now, of course, the proportions are gradually changing. But the care aspects have to be intergenerational. And what we find in Asian countries is the older people also providing a lot of care for the young, and the young providing care for the old. So there is a lot of bonding. The only thing is that we have to see that this is maintained amicably, and we reduce elder abuse cases. So there is more emphasis being laid on education, value education from the younger age, from school, colleges. At the workplace, we are making more arrangements for people of all ages to work together. And the social security system is trying to bring about intergenerational bonding. So in many ways, it's to help to add on to the solidarity. And similarly, we are finding in the health sector too, the emphasis which is coming from life course perspective is looking at things from a positive image of aging, which brings generations together. So there are various ways in which it is being promoted, and subtly there is emphasis being brought about to bring the generations together. Thank you.
Okay, so I don't see any more questions. Well, I have to thank both Marcela and both Mala as well as Alexandre, but I have just got to know Marcela, and Mala, I've been known her for some time now. But thank you very much for taking the time to prepare, to present, to be available. I know that you lead very, very busy lives. And I'm not saying this lightly. I know it's very difficult to find so good people, professional people that are that are willing to share, not because they don't want to, but because of time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marvin, for putting it all together. Thank you so much.
We'll be in touch. We'll be in touch.
Yeah.
Bye, and thank you to everybody.
To be part of the panel. Thank you so much.